Let's talk about research. So my name is Emma Cardiff and I'm Head of Research and Innovation at Marie Curie. So our plan for this session is we have 3 talks. The first from Professor Catherine Walsh from the University of Lancaster, who's going to talk to us about the barriers and facilitators to palliative and end-of-life care. The second from Catherine Adams, our Senior Research Governance Manager at Marie Curie, who's going to talk about research governance and how that applies to hospices. And the last talk from me around engaging hospice staff in research. And hopefully these are approximately 7 minutes each, and we will really try hard to keep the time to allow us plenty. And Julie's here, and she's going to be waving if any of us go over. So hopefully that will leave us plenty of time for questions. I just wondered, there are plenty of my Marie Curie colleagues in the room here, and I just wondered if you could give a little wave, actually, because I think it'd be really helpful to know who you are, and so that I'm sure all of my lovely colleagues would welcome conversations after the session if anyone wants to know more about the work that we do around research capacity building at Marie Curie. Catherine.
Oh, that's the second slide. I haven't even touched anything, so I'm not taking any blame for that. Okay, so I'm delighted to be giving a quick overview today of some work we've done very recently looking at barriers and facilitators to palliative care research. And clearly a cast of thousands involved in some of this, and at least one person in the audience who was part of doing some of this work. So what we wanted to do, we've been funded by the NIHR as one of the palliative care research networks that they funded to try and stimulate excellent palliative care research. And ours is geographically focused. And we thought before we did anything, we really wanted to know what people found were the barriers and facilitators to research, so we could put something in place that actually would help people. We knew some of the barriers and facilitators because almost a decade ago now, some of my colleagues, Sheila Payne and Nancy Preston, were involved in what was then Help the Hospice report on why hospices should be involved in research. And it's still available online. It's a great read. And the sad thing is, nearly a decade later, the things that they found then are still barriers now. So research is often the missing link in palliative care. And when you see the results that we found, you can see that it is still the missing link in palliative care. We focus on education, we focus on clinical practice, we focus on fundraising, we focus on all sorts of things, but very few hospices have a focus on research. We need to change that. So we sent a survey out and we were absolutely blown over. Given this was just northwest coast, which is Cumbria, Lancashire, Cheshire and Merseyside, we had nearly 300 respondents. And we then ran a series of working groups to dig into some of this a little bit more. You can see the people who filled it in were generally people like you. Lots of people from our local hospices, lots of them were nurses, some researchers, but the vast majority of them were clinicians working in generalist and specialist palliative care across the region. And if you want to count, there are 293 people there. So what did we find? Because that's what I'm really going to focus on. So what we found, I have categorised in 4 different categories. Organisational culture and capacity, research knowledge, research infrastructure, and patient and public perceptions. And remember those colours, because each time I talk about one of those, it will be colour-coded either orange, green, purple, or blue. So these were the 4 barriers that people talked about. Now I'm going to look at the top 5 barriers first, and then barriers 6 to 10. So we asked about barriers in the survey, and on the left-hand side, you can see the survey ranking. And then we inductively asked about barriers in the working groups. So in the working group 1, 2, 3, 4, you can see the barriers that came out inductively. What you can see there is a lot of orange and green. There's no blue even on that first page of barriers. The things that are in the way, often we have control over ourselves. because you can see one of the top barriers is organisational culture and capacity. That's our organisations, our culture, our capacity. We can do something about that. So, do we have protected time? You can see that's top than some of the others. Do we have a research culture? Do we recognise the importance of research? You can see all of these up there. Research knowledge, we can also do something about. You know, we can collaborate with others. We can increase our research knowledge. But you have to be aware, to be fully involved in research, that actually requires quite a lot of research knowledge. And that isn't going to be held just in one person. There are also some comments up here at the top about the research infrastructure. That was a focus also on collaboration, the financial infrastructure, and I know, Catherine's going to be talking later about governance. That came through very strongly as well. It's confusing. These were the next 5 barriers. It was only then here, when we were looking at barriers 6 to 10, that actually some of the things about patient and public perception started to come through. And often when you talk to somebody, they say, we shouldn't be involving patients in research. Actually, these were not the major barriers at all. It continues to be primarily orange, green, and purple. So my challenge to you is we can do something about this. This is within our power to change, but we have to have the culture to do that, but also the capacity to do that. And that's not just people who have a responsibility for research, but who have the skills, knowledge, and expertise to be able to facilitate that and to work in collaboration with others. Because the one thing research ain't is an individual endeavour. It's a collaborative endeavour. So here are some of the quotes, particularly from the working groups. And you can see here the culture and capacity issues, that actually, if all we're asked to do is to meet the clinical KPIs, we're not going to find the time for research. There isn't that buy-in because we're not measuring it, and if we don't measure something, then it's not important. There was a lot of confusion. This was a really common comment. It's a minefield of information. And yeah, research and research governance is complicated. There's a reason, I suppose, since I changed from being a clinician to a researcher, that nearly 20 years later, I'm still learning stuff about research. I gave an example the other day. I'm a nurse by background. I've watched a lot of abdominal paracenteses. You wouldn't let me loose doing one. Okay, I haven't worked clinically for 20 years now. But someone who's seen a bit of research thinks they can go and do it. And it's not, it's exactly the same. It's a real skill that requires expertise and knowledge. So you've got to partner with people to do it. Research is scary. We're 1 million miles away from that in our hospice. But they just don't know how to do things. And again, it is about that collaboration, but recognising where you are on your journey and where you could go to. And as I say, probably the least important was actually really getting patients and families involved in research. And the reality is, of course, you have to go through a lot of barriers to even get to this point, to ask somebody if they want to take part. And we know that people will take part, but as I say, this came through as probably the least important. We then asked people about what would facilitate research, so it wasn't all about barriers. And you can see here, these are the top 10. And there's nothing in that blue thing again. The top 10 facilitators were not about facilitating and encouraging patients to be involved in research. You can see yet again they're orange, green, and purple. About having research staff, about having an active research group at work, about having a supportive clinical lead, about providing cover for people to do research, being part of networks, attending seminars, having research guides and manuals, collaborating with others, having those policies and structures. So again, I'm going to finish with a real emphasis. We can't do, I think people do take part in research. That's a different talk entirely. But we can do something about nearly all of those orange, green, and purple things. And I think when Emma and Catherine are going to speak, they're going to talk a little bit more about some of those things we can do to make a difference. So in 10 years' time, when I'm even greyer, I'm not still standing here saying we haven't changed, but actually the people in the room are actively involved in research in their local hospices. Thank you.
Many thanks, Catherine, for that call to action. Yeah, and hopefully, as Catherine said, Catherine Adams and I can then follow up with some of the experiences we've had and some of the things we've been doing at Marie Curie to address those challenges. Catherine.
Thank you, Emma and Catherine. Yeah, I've been working in research governance for too many years now, and I would safely say that not much has moved on. So I'm going to talk today, unsurprisingly, about research governance. I'm the Senior Research Governance Manager at Marie Curie. And it's quite easy to say that research governance is the barrier, but what exactly is the barrier? What are we trying to grapple with here? It's quite a broad term, so I thought it might be helpful just to kind of pinpoint some of the key areas that are causing us some problems and look to see how we can try to make some of these enablers and make them a bit less problematic than they might at first seem. So research governance is about driving up quality, and it's about protecting participants, ultimately. So the key thing that's important to us is to make sure that the legal regulatory systems are in place, that we're behaving ethically, and we are setting out responsibilities for organisations so participants can feel assured that the research they're taking part in is worthwhile. So let's start with necessary approvals. So one of the first questions that I get asked in my role at Marie Curie, and also in my role in the NHS, I have a dual role, is my study research at all? Does it need any approvals? What approvals do I need? How do I go about getting them? And for most studies, university ethics approval is probably sufficient for your research, particularly if you're involving participants in, say, interviews, surveys, less interventional studies. But there is a raft of requirement for legal approval through the HRA, the Health Research Authority, NHS ethics system, and this comes as some surprise to some. So I've listed some of them here. There's a more comprehensive list on the information sheet guide that I have at the front here that you're more than welcome to take away with you. So firstly, people who lack capacity to give informed consent to take part or keep taking part in research. If your hospice or community services are involved in a study that involves people who lack capacity to consent, then you must go through the NHS Research Ethics Health Research Authority process. That's a legal requirement. Also, similarly for accessing or processing confidential patient information without consent, where this would otherwise breach confidentiality, that must go through NHS HRA approval as well. Now, this is where we start getting into some surprising areas, and you ask anybody in the NHS, they won't know the final two here either. In Northern Ireland and Wales, there is a specific requirement for patients or information about them in independent hospitals or clinics, which include hospices with overnight beds, must go for a legal HRA review requirement. And also Northern Ireland, residents, patients in private or voluntary sector nursing homes, care homes, healthcare establishment agencies, and weirdly, fire brigades, fire authorities, strangely enough, they also fall under the final requirement as well. I didn't want to cover human tissue or radiation or devices, medical devices. drug trials, but they go through as routine as well. But I just thought those areas might be of surprise to some people, and it's really important that you know what these requirements are if you're undertaking research, to make sure you're going through the correct system. Okay, so moving on to compliance with data regulations. Well, there's bureaucracy staring us right in the face, isn't it there? Now, that's a real barrier in people's minds to, oh my goodness, what am I doing? Am I doing the right thing? What should I be doing? Should I even be accessing this data? Should my colleagues be accessing this data? I'm going to share this. Should I share this? So there's a whole ton of difficulty around this area. But if we start to think of it in terms of what are we trying to achieve here? So we're trying to make sure that we're being very clear to the participant about what's going to happen to their data. And if we can clearly communicate that, then that's half the battle won, and half of our regulation requirement met. It can seem tricky. There's all sorts of data regulations there. There's GDPR, there's data protection, there's confidentiality, code of conduct. There's all sorts here to comply with. But luckily for us, we're only interested in identifiable data, so it's identifiable data that falls under most of this legislation. So having a clear plan in place and knowing yourself when you're going to anonymise data, if you are, when it's going to be transferred, how and to whom, how that data is going to be stored, how it's going to be secured, and how it's going to be destroyed. So knowing those key things will really help you to be able to meet this data requirements, regulatory requirements. And obviously, as I said, communicating that via your information sheet is really important too. So again, there's some further links to references, guidance on the sheet at the front. There's quite a few on there, because 7 minutes is quite a challenge. So I've just basically kind of covering the headlines here and then just putting a lot of information into some guidance document that I hope you'll take away with you. Okay, so moving on, insurance. Insurance, strangely, seems to be a real worry for people, and understandably so, given that the NHS has millions to dish out. If there's a problem, hospices, not so much. And again, we've got to think about reputational risk as well. By and large, it's not a problem for you, but it may be a problem for your sponsor organisations. So by and large, if you're doing some research for university, for example, they will be covering they will be the sponsor of that research, and they are responsible for providing management and design cover for the research. So largely, those areas are not your problem; they are somebody else's problem. So, but moving on to conduct, conduct is everyone's problem, because your employer is responsible for you undertaking the research. So if you are, by and large, usual activities are covered. So there is an understanding that research is part of usual business, and usual business falls within your job description capabilities, then you should be absolutely fine. If in doubt, check, obviously, and particularly do contact your organisation legal department if you have one, or insurer if you have one, to check whether you're insured for undertaking anything that's slightly outside of your usual, not so much level of competence, but just slightly outside of your usual practice. So if you're delivering an intervention that's novel, or you're using a device that isn't something that you would do day to day, then it's best to check with your insurance, with your organisation, that you are covered for that activity. This is probably the most important thing, but it's the thing I'm going to skim over most, really, because I think if you've got all the rest in place, it really is about reflecting that in the information sheet, the participant information sheet. So a very clear description of what's involved, what the risks are, what the benefits are, who's responsible for the study, as I mentioned, who the sponsor is, really clear description of what arrangements are in place if things go wrong, how the data is going to be used, who it's going to be shared with, including details about data security, integrity, what's going to happen to it, including after the study, some clarity about how mental capacity is going to be assessed, and what will happen to the data if capacity is lost. So being really clear about that, with some contact points for some complaints. And again, there's a link there. I'm going to rely on my links a lot. There's some information there about the ideal consent form and the ideal participant information sheet. So a lot of what we do at Marie Curie is centralised governance checks, and they're based on the NHS's. So these links are to the NHS, but they are legal requirements, so they work across board for any setting, any organisation. Okay, so again, those are the references that I've put on the sheet. So the first one is it research, which is a really, really handy algorithm that will tell you whether or not it is research that you need approval for and how to go about getting that, whether that is from the Health Research Authority or whether that can be through university ethics departments. Again, some template information sheets, consent forms, some bog standard GDPR wording. If you nick that wording and put it in your information sheet, you've basically met your GDPR requirements. So there you go. I should charge for that because that's well worth having. When NHS ethics is required, do I need NHS ethics approval? Again, there's that list there. That list is longer, but I just picked out the most common types of research that I've come across from my experience at Marie Curie and within the NHS. Roles and responsibilities is all about sponsorship. That can be a bit tricky, but generally you'll find that if you're doing a piece of research or it's coming to you from somewhere else, somebody else has kind of ironed that out before you start. But that's quite interesting to kind of see what your responsibilities are as principal investigators and what the sponsor's responsibilities are. And that's quite a kind of neat bit to pass blame slightly over or released responsibility over, so that it frees you up with some time to get on with your research. So that's the end of my session. My feeling is that governance shouldn't be more difficult than the actual research that you're undertaking is. And I know that it can seem very daunting and a big kind of thing that we can't sometimes nail down, but hopefully that's kind of shed some light and possibly halved the problem. Okay.
Thanks a million, Catherine, for that really helpful overview. And frankly, we are really lucky to have you at Marie Curie to support us with some of those challenges. Okay, so final 7-minute whirlwind talk from me. So I'm going to talk about engaging hospice staff in research, and this is very much a collaborative effort with all my lovely colleagues who are sitting in the room today who've really given me some advice about the strategies they've used to engage staff over the last kind of decade or so. And hopefully this will follow on nicely from Catherine's talk and looking at some of those barriers. So the first thing to do really is develop your pitch. What's the sell? Why should we do research? Why do we do research? It's interesting following on from Catherine's talk. Firstly, and most importantly, as far as we're concerned, it's because patients and families really do want the opportunity to participate in research, as the quotes here from a patient and family member in our Liverpool hospice illustrates. There are lots of different motivations for this. People want to give something back. They want to make a difference. They want to help people in the future, even if it doesn't help them themselves, and they may well be they're well aware of that. And often, in our experience, participation in research can actually be really therapeutic for some people. And I think in our experience, sharing those patient stories is an incredibly powerful tool to bring down some of the barriers, particularly around gatekeeping of patients and families in the hospices and around their participation in research. But there are other great reasons for doing research. That's just the first sell. It's great to understand the population that you serve. Research is an excellent way of doing that. We desperately need to produce up-to-date targeted evidence if we're to deliver the best care to all that takes consideration of geographical location, support network, condition, ethnic group, that considers all of those things, so we know what intervention works for whom and in what context. Evidence is the way you're going to do that. Research is the way you're going to get the evidence to implement change and to drive some of those improvements. But also just thinking again about the patients and families wanting to participate in research, it's also around equity, as that quote there illustrates. Why should I not be approached to take part just because I have a terminal illness doesn't mean I don't want to help. People really do want to help. So the second strategy we've used at Marie Curie is embedding staff in research. We've had a real commitment to building research capacity and our people. And in 2008, we brought in our first research lead at Marie Curie Hospice in Belfast to facilitate and manage research. And that was really successful. And over the last decade or so, that programme has evolved. And we now have 6 Marie Curie Senior Research Fellows within Marie Curie working across the hospices, and 8 research nurses in 9 of our hospices, with a view to expanding that. And these roles have been incredibly important. Firstly, bridging the gap between the competing pressures of clinical practice and research. But it's someone who's around, someone who's visible, someone who's available, who can demystify research and to find some of the novel solutions to the obstacles in order to support others and to enable people to participate in research, to enable patients and families to be involved in research. It's someone who can make connections, who spends time getting to know staff, understanding the roles, understanding the challenges, understanding what people are interested in. Now, I appreciate the slightly unique position that we're in at Marie Curie, and for a lot of more independent hospices, it may not be possible to embed dedicated research staff in the hospice. However, could you identify a research champion? Perhaps you could be the research champion, and that's why you're here today. So I think there are other options available. So number 3, what are some of the engagement techniques that we've used over the last decade or so to engage staff in research? Well, there's something about introducing staff to research and to build confidence. An excellent way of doing this is to consider how they practice now. How do people practice now? It's probably based on years of research to get to that place. Use local examples of how research has informed policy and practice. That's an excellent tool to really get people on board and to help people understand why research is important. Find ways to raise awareness within the hospice. Could you have a research group, for example? If that's not possible, how could you embed it in your existing governance structure? Could there be a 10-minute slot in one of the other meetings that you attend to talk about research, to discuss a new piece of research that might inform practice? It's possible to identify a range of studies for people to be involved in, whether that's patients, families and staff to be involved in research. It's great to take opportunities to embed research into daily work in all areas of the hospice, ideally. And one of the most important take-home messages, and I think that we've learned over years, is that senior buy-in is incredibly important. If we are to have the vision and aspire to have research as business as usual within our organisations to enable the best care for our patients and families, everybody has to be on board. That includes the trustees. Also really important to engage with all departments, fundraising, business, volunteering. They all have individual needs and they're not always recognised. And this is an excellent example from our wonderful colleagues in Liverpool around their journal club. They're in the audience today, so thank you guys. And that's Sarah Stanley and Amian Wasu. And they developed a multidisciplinary journal club to engage staff with research. And again, to kind of bridge that gap between research and practice. And this has been extremely successful. Staff are more engaged because they found the research educational, but also interesting and relevant. The journal club had generated its own research questions, and this has directly impacted care through quality improvement projects at the hospice. And it's also been shared, the journal club was also shared virtually with other hospices across the region, to enable that shared learning. And they've actually just recently received funding to develop a toolkit to support the implementation of the Journal Club in other hospices. So watch this space. And if you want to know more about the Journal Club, Dr. Tom Steele is talking tomorrow in parallel session 6 at 1 p.m. Lastly, is capacity and collaboration. As Catherine said earlier, research does require training, it requires expertise, and frankly, in all areas of research that we do, we collaborate. So we've talked a bit about building research capacity at the hospice, and I've sort of mentioned that point about senior buy-in and how vital that is, and to try to embed research somewhere, albeit small, within your governance structures. But there is something around what's in your local area in order to sort of catalyse that capacity building. Who has similar interests? What is there in your local area? Is there another hospice, NHS trust, university? Who has similar interests? Who could you collaborate with? As we know, palliative care is very much holistic practice, and so is the research that we do. So utilise this. Over the years, I think I've collaborated with people in design, in business, arts, humanities, alongside clinical subjects, and utilise that. Where is the interest? It may not be quite where you think it is. But are there existing collaborations that you could be part of within your local area? And there are some great examples of this, of linking up within local palliative care research networks to share experiences, to share resources, again, to catalyse that capacity, find collaborators with similar interests. So some great examples was one in the West Midlands. Rachel Perry and John McCartney, our dynamic duo research nurse and fellow in the West Midlands, are part of the West Midlands Community Palliative Care Partnership. And they do exactly that. They've come together with a view to providing best end-of-life care in that region, and knowing that collaborating really is the way forward. There's a similar palliative care research programme in the North East that brings together the hospices, universities and NHS trusts to deliver best care through research within that region. And there's also perhaps your local NIHR clinical research network. So a few take-home messages for the most part. Patients and families absolutely do want to be involved in research. If you can, give them the opportunity to do that. That's how we're going to learn. That's how we're going to enable best care. If it's possible, embedded, dedicated and passionate research champions are the way to get that forward, to get that moving and to get research done at your hospice. But the vision, what we have to aspire to, is that research is business as usual. But it needs to, in order for that to happen, we need to move it up the organisational agenda. Can you have a role in doing that? That could be within your hospice, it could be within your region. Is there anything that you could do to move research up the agenda? If you'd like to know a bit more about this or about getting started in research, our Marie Curie research nurses are hosting a workshop at our conference in February, and we would absolutely love to see you if you'd like to register. Hit the QR code there. And there's an excellent reference from my colleague Sarah, who's also in the audience here, if you'd like a bit more information. Thank you very much. So I'd like to introduce you to Amin Boyle, who's research lead at Sue Ryder, who's going to chair our discussion. Hands up, please let us know if you have questions and who you might like to address it to, or we'll all happily answer and chip in. Thank you.
Hello, thank you everyone, and it's a great pleasure to have so many people here in the lunch break, so thank you. So I'd like to open it up for any questions or to share any good practices you're doing around research with the audience. And Julia's kindly said she'll go around with the mic. I'll grab the mic. So has anyone got any questions for the panel or wants to share good practice? If you could just note which panel member as well, that'd be great.
Any of you. My question is about enticing other people into doing research. For example, when you wanted maybe to speak to GPs or some people who might engage with hospices to get their view, because that's something I've struggled with at the moment, is trying to, get them to actually give a little bit of their time. What tips have you got for that?
Is this on? Yeah. Oh, you can hear me. I guess my top tip for that is you have to have an ask that is meaningful to them. So, and I guess looking at it from my perspective, sometimes people, they don't just rock up. But, let's say they rock up at the university and say, I want to talk to you about research. Now, of course, I'll talk to you about research, but what is it that you're actually interested in? And I think the same with GPs. GPs are super stretched at the moment. We know that. They're some of the busiest people on the planet. So if you're going to hook them in, you have to have a really specific ask. You have to be really clear about what that ask is, and it has to be hooked into something that is of value to them, sold so that they understand the value. And I think actually all of that is perfectly possible to do, but it's about that the specificity in my world, certainly, when I'm going out and trying to engage other people in research, including GPs and other extraordinarily busy clinicians.
Yeah, I don't think I have a huge amount to add to that, other than I empathise. It is a huge challenge, and I think thinking of consultation times, if there's maybe, you know, an extra minute added on to that to talk about research, and I think a lot of the research that we are involved with is often quite sensitive, and it does need quite a bit of time and quite a nuanced discussion around it. You can't really go in all guns blazing with those discussions. And I think that has to be considered too, and that's, I guess that's another challenge that we have to think about up front, and I second that, being as clear as possible with what the ask is and exactly what you want from them. And we've used strategies over the years of even writing a short script for GPs. One of the studies I'm involved with at the moment is around financial hardship and some of the challenges of dying at home. And we were trying to recruit through GP practices in addition to other ways of recruiting. And I think when we brought the research project, as much as they could see it was important, the immediate thing was the discussion's going to take a long time. That's a tricky one. I can't just bring that up in conversation out of nowhere. And we did develop a script, and there was a lot of discussion about the challenge around language. We thought the challenge would be around the conversation around death and dying. It wasn't. It was the conversation around poverty that was the difficult one. So yeah, we came up with a script, still struggled with recruitment, but I think part of that is they're just so stretched at the moment. But yeah, that's some of the strategies we've used. But I empathise.
Thank you. There, and then come to you next.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for this session. I'm Candy McCabe. I'm the Head of Education Research at Dorothy House Hospice, and I started working in the world of hospices about 3 years ago, having come from a clinical research career in secondary care, where I was really used to the clinical research nurses having fairly sustainable funding through the clinical research network and good funding into secondary care for the conduct of research. So it came as quite a surprise to me how poorly hospices and clinical research nurses are supported by the CRN, and we've been lobbying locally with our CRN, and they've been incredibly supportive and have given us a bit of funding, but by no means enough to cover a research nurse to be doing portfolio studies. And I just wondered if others in the room have had greater success, or if Marie Curie is lobbying in any way, or if there's something as a group we can do to try and change the funding structure to better represent what happens in secondary care.
We very much welcome that discussion. Rachel, I see you've got your hand up. You might be a great person to, yeah.
My post was initially funded by the CRN, just 5 hours a week, and then Marie Curie matched that. So that's how we got started, and then built up more awareness of research, and then the CRN was very helpful in getting more funding for me. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It was just it was just over a period of time, perseverance, really.
Sorry, can't really hear you. One thing, the NIHR CRNs, they have got funding for third sector organisations, so you have to go there and say, you've got funding for it, how can you supply research nurses? And it will take a bit of time. Certain CRNs are more agile and can work across different sectors, but they have got the funding, and you have to say, look, the government's giving you specific money for this, how can we work together to try and get that into our hospices? So I think it's building that kind of collaboration with your local clinical research networks and building it up, and I think it will just take time. Julie, we had a hand up over here as well.
Could I
Did
just
anyone
add
else?
to that?
Yeah,
sorry, can I just add to that?
Yeah.
Just for any Scottish colleagues in the room, we don't have the CRN. So we're hoping to start other conversations in Scotland about how we might be able to get to access and research nurse support within the boards. Catherine, you might say.
I would add that it really is about banging on the door. Care homes have been a bit of a step ahead of this and have had funding through Enrich, and there is no reason why hospice research isn't as important. it brings in the recruiting to portfolio studies. There's no reason why we can't be on the portfolio, and there's money through that as well. So I think just keep banging the drum on that research is. I think if you talk to CRNs, they agree that it's really valuable. They want to support it. They just don't know how. So I think it's just keep that message going through. I'm having a conversation with them next week about funding, about this kind of belief that the hospices are part of secondary care and the money filters through somehow. So I think we just need to keep hammering home the importance and that we can support the wider agenda of research and health research, but we do need some recompense for it. It can't be that we're working at a loss to do that.
Thank you. Is there anything else from the panel?
So I suppose just be assured that we are having that conversation, and perhaps we do need to come together and campaign for that. But yes, it's certainly on our radar.
Thank you.
Kind of continuing the theme, thank you, Fiona Rawlinson from Cardiff. The thing that strikes me, having been in palliative care for a long time, and like Catherine, hearing the messages again and again, we can sometimes, I think, feel daunted by research, but please don't be. You know, researchers need clinicians, clinicians need researchers. It's a collaboration. Everybody in every organisation has got a role to play. And palliative care is about communication. We are expert communicators, whether we are researchers or clinicians, and so we can use these skills. And I think the emphasis in this session and this conference about what we can do. Yes, we know what the challenges are, but what we can do a lot. And in my clinical organisation, we are kind of, we've got a kind of a rotating interest, so we're giving different people in the organisation the role of organising the journal clubs, just so the skills don't stick with one person. We're sharing, we're supporting, we're mentoring. And just the last thing to say is an additional organisation is there for people running alongside all the research organisations, which is the Palliative Care Research Society. We've been reborn over the last 12 to 18 months. We run a series of webinars, as some of you may know, but we are there to help support researchers at all levels. If it's just I've got an idea, but I don't know how to take it forward, then please find us on Twitter and come and talk to us. But thank you. This is an energising session, so let's hope 10 years from now we're talking about all the projects we've done. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, and I would just echo that taking off my head of research hat for a minute and putting on my researcher hat for a minute. If people from hospice contact us, be absolutely over the moon, because frankly, often for researchers, having access to patients, families and staff is a real challenge. And it takes a long time to build those relationships. I speak from my own experience of nearly 20 years doing this. It takes a long time to nurture those relationships and for people to build trust with you. And so yeah, you're playing the slow game, but it's definitely worth it.
Hello, I'm Amy. I know that becomes me, but I'm one of the research lead from the Marie Curie Liverpool Hospice. It was just to kind of add some kind of reflections as well to the discussion about the ongoing kind of challenges of trying to have kind of research nurses in hospices. And I think in addition to the NIHR CRN approach, because we kind of had that as well, where Sarah here, who's the research nurse of Marie Curie, in 2017, you were doing a research comment based on a grant that we had, and NIHR, the CRN were funding your session after that for, was it 5 hours a week? And I think in addition to NIHR, we had some success with the local clinical commissioning group. So I was talking to them and working out when they were having the small grants just to develop research locally. So I'm aware that that's going to be different depending on the regions that you're in and what funding is available for research. But in Liverpool, the CCG did have a research pot. So we made sure that we were always there to try to make use of that, because the research focus is often around several themes, and one of those themes was usually trying to improve kind of end-of-life care. So rather than it being quite a specific thing, we just made sure that we would always put money in for that research pot, and then we were asking for funding to release Sarah to do research. So I think I've had 3 grants from the CCG for various things, which we've been able to put aside for research funding costs before your post became a permanent research post.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you. So I'm just going to put it back to the panel if they've got any final comments before we close. I'm mindful that we need to do the transition to the next room shortly. Is there anything?
I'd just like to make an organisational comment, because one of the other hats that I've held for the last 9 years until just recently is a hospice trustee. And I can say quite literally that research was not on the agenda. I've also had a conversation recently with our clinical network, not the clinical research network, and I can say categorically that research, literally they said, was not on the agenda. So unless we prioritise research, so, you know, for an independent hospice, you will be governed by a board of trustees. So you need to be asking them to put research on the agenda. Where does it sit within the structures of your organisation? And if you can't answer that question immediately, then you need to go back to your organisations and say, where are we going to put it on the agenda? And I mean quite literally the agenda. Which meeting agenda is it going to be on? You know, is it brought to the Board of Trustees? Is it in your clinical quality group or whatever it may well be? Because I think unless we start to attack this from an organisational and structural perspective as well, we're going to constantly be trying to chip away from the bottom up and never attack it from the top down. And I think that's really important as well.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. If you've got any questions for the panel members, if you catch them in the break times, but thank you very much for attending the session, and we'll see you throughout the conference.